My story really starts back in the 20s and 30s. I was born in 1933 in Seward, but my story really started 10 years before when my father was looking at a newspaper in Montana and responded to an ad for people to come to Alaska and work on the Alaska Railroad. So he took the train to Seattle in a ship to Seward, a steamship to Seward, and he ended up in Seward in April of 1923. And then my sister and their 2-year-old daughter took the same route, and they arrived at about the time that President Harding came up and visited Seward and went on to Nenana and drove the Golden Spike that commemorated the completion of the Alaska Railroad from Seward to Fairbanks. So my brother was born in 1929, my brother Jack, and I was born in 1933. I was born there was a black tarpaper shack that we lived in right next to the railroad tracks, and the engines, steam engines, and the trains would be made up at night, and our little shack would shake and roll. But we had freedom. As soon as I could walk, we were playing out on the railroad tracks. We were going over to the roundhouse to see my dad. We were my sister and her dog. They loved the beach, which was on Resurrection Bay. And so we had a lot of freedom. And the year I was born was when Roosevelt came into power, and Hitler came to power as well. And I always remember early, often alcohol-fueled discussions and politics being talked about a lot in my home and amongst my parents and their friends. They were concerned about prohibition. They were concerned they were concerned about a lot of political issues at the time, the Depression, the fear of a war, and the draft was being discussed. So that was kind of scary times for us. And then in 1936, my brother Dale came along, and he replaced my status in the family as being the most spoiled and the youngest. So that was difficult. And then about the same time, my folks had lived in this little black tarpaper shack, and there was 6 of us there, and there was only 3 rooms, and there was a still for making moonshine hid on the front porch. And they were really enforcing the laws on prohibition in the territory of Alaska. We felt we should be excluded, but apparently we weren't. Well, my mother, she had enough of this, and so we moved. We moved to the property on the north end of First Avenue in Seward, and it was paradise. We had Mount Marathon was our new playground, and First Lake, and there was a waterfall behind the house. We had a wonderful time exploring there. And then in November, the middle of November in 1941, my sister had gotten married a couple months before, and they had rented a small house down by the Seward Hotel on Fifth Avenue. And I wakened to a commotion in the kitchen, and I came out, and my brother-in-law was standing there. He was totally encased in ice. And I looked out the window, and the whole sky was lit up. Seward was burning. And they were trying to fight the fire, but it was cold and windy and just a bitterly cold night. And they were trying to fight the fire, and they had no water pressure. So the little water that came out of the hose just froze as it came out. And anyway, he was just covered in ice. But the Army had moved in, and they were helping to fight the fire. So they thought it would be a good idea to dynamite the fire and try to suppress it. Well, it's what happened is that it spread the fire, and so the next morning we got up, and there was the two-story arcade apartment building was gone, and one half of the east side of 4th Avenue and all the buildings and hotels and everything were demolished, along with my sister's little house. And then about a week later, or 2 weeks later, 2 or 3 weeks later, was December 7th, 1941, and it found our whole family huddled around a shortwave radio, and President Roosevelt was telling us about the attack on Pearl Harbor, and that we had declared, that the United States had declared war on Japan. It was a memorable day. I was only 8 years old, but I remember it as if it was yesterday. And the Army had been building up in Seward for quite some time, and there was probably more soldiers in town than what there was residents. But as soon as the war broke out, they sealed off the waterfront, and they fenced it off and patrolled it, and we had to put paper or curtains, heavy curtains over our windows, because they were afraid that we were going to have an attack. There was rumors of submarines being in Resurrection Bay, and so they put gun encampments at various points out the bay. But it was a really scary time, scary, dark time. And then in 1947, in February of 1947, we had a shipwreck, in that the vessel Yukon went aground in Johnstone Bay. And there again, it was a blizzard, and they must have got turned around. And so they ended up putting the ship on a beach with a high cliff, and the ship broke in two, and it took 2 days to get rescue vessels in to help the people. So that was kind of a disaster. There were all the survivors were brought into Seward, and the community really helped them a lot. But I was working at the hospital at the time, and I remember the beds stacked up in the hallway, the basement, any place they could have a bed with these soldiers that were going home after the war with frozen feet and frozen hands. It was a really tough time. But school was a fun time in Seward. We had no buses. We walked every place. And the teachers were dedicated and tough, so we learned or else. But one thing, when I was in high school, there was a good-looking guy that came from Seattle. And so that kept me interested in school. But he ended up being the love of my life, and we graduated from high school together, but then that's a whole new story. But my dad had been waiting for a railroad settlement, a back pay railroad settlement, and anyway, the year I graduated from high school, his settlement came through, and he gave me the money so I could leave and go to college for a year. So I boarded one of those steamship vessels that I've been watching coming and going, and wishing to hell I could get out of Alaska. And I left Alaska on one of those ships for the first time when I was 18 years old. Thank you.